Interesting. It's, we don't have anyone on Earth who does this now, so we don't know like if there are like neurological changes that happen if you change the brain shape that way, because you're not just changing the skull, right? If you bind an infant skull that way, it actually morphologically, like, that's a different brain.
Right. I
Yeah.
wondered. So it was like the front part of the brain, right? Like the medial prefrontal cortex, the
Yeah, and then
personality.
it gets taller on the back as well. So yeah, but some of them, the volume of, we have the skulls, right? We have some physical skulls that have evidence of binding like this. And so yeah, it's the total brain volume is like 15 to 20% higher.
It increases the mass of the brain.
Yeah.
What? That's pretty weird. Huh.
Yeah, like I kind of like to, I mean, it's not ethical, right? There's no ethical way to do this experiment, but it'd be kind of interesting to find out like what that means in terms of cognition and, cool. So it's 5.
Yeah, I'm so I just went live on Facebook, and we'll get started here pretty soon. I'm just making sure that the stream is working. Yeah, that's really wild, man. It's cool that you collect those things. I'm thinking about like equipotentiality, the ability of one neuron to do the job of any other neuron, and how
Interesting. Yeah.
how that might work, or what that might look like if there was 15% more brain. Like, I wonder if it would be specialized, or if it would just be more of the same.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways to find out. But
yeah, man. So are you gonna have a kid and bind his skull? Is that what you're?
Yeah, I'm definitely team no babies. But...
Okay. Okay, so I think we should be live to Facebook now. So hello, Facebook. Webinar is streaming now live on Facebook. We've only got 6 attendees here, but there were many more than that said they were coming. So do you just want to wait a couple minutes?
Is there going to be a replay option or?
Yeah, I think there should be.
Yeah, so let's just get started, and they can replay if they want.
Cool. All right, man. So how this is going to go is I figure I'll introduce myself and Psychedelic Club, then you can introduce yourself and DanceSafe, and then we'll just get going into the questions. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
Cool. Alrighty, so my name is Clayton. I'm president of the National Board of Psychedelic Club. Psychedelic Club is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to folding psychedelics into the social and cultural mainstream. We were founded on the campus of the University of Colorado Boulder in 2015, and we've since grown to 24 chapters around the country. To find out more or to get involved, you can visit us at psychedelicclub.com or Facebook. Mitchell?
Hey, I'm Mitchell Gomez. I'm the executive director of DanceSafe. DanceSafe is a 501c3 nonprofit. So we do harm reduction, health education, primarily within the electronic music space, although we do a lot of other stuff as well. And you can see what we're up to at dancesafe.org.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you, man. So Mitchell has graciously decided to give us his time and answer some of these weird questions that we've come up with. So what we've done is we've kind of petitioned the chapters and the Facebook pages for questions to ask Mitchell today. We've got maybe a dozen or so that we're going to go through. And if there's time at the end, then we'll also ask some questions of the audience. So some kind of notification. Alrighty, so the first question, we're just going to kind of dive right in. A lot of these end up being sort of similar, or having some sort of theme that'll probably emerge. So the first one, how does COVID change the fight against the war on drugs? What's the same and what's different?
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things I learned, I'm in the process of writing a book about the drug war, and one of the things that I sort of started to realize when doing this research is that one of the things that really ended alcohol prohibition was not so much sort of changing political or social norms or activism. It was really about states running out of money during the Depression to effectively enforce the war against alcohol. They sort of didn't have the organizational or operational capacity to enforce alcohol prohibition. I'm very hopeful that we're going to be able to avoid spinning into another depression because of COVID, but it seems likely. It seems likely that we're in for a sort of long, slow economic recovery, particularly if we can't develop an effective treatment, if we don't have a vaccine for a long time. There's questions now whether natural herd immunity is even going to be a thing with COVID, because apparently the antibodies flush out of your body really quickly. And so people just sort of don't develop long-term immunity. This is also, super speculative. It's just such a new disease. I think it's important when we have negative things happen that we use them to the best advantage to improve society as best we can. And to me, the drug war is sort of the key linchpin for a lot of civil rights violations, for a lot of structural racism. A lot of it is fought through the drug war. And so the faster we can end the drug war, the better. So I'm hopeful that if things take a downturn, we can use that economic force to help end the drug war. But certainly in terms of how the other side is fighting the drug war, not a whole lot has changed, right? They're still arresting people. They're still prosecuting people. They're still sending people into prisons where COVID is just running rampant. And so still today, by far the most dangerous thing that happens with most drug users and most drugs around their drug use is the potential of getting caught. That's far more serious than the sort of medical outcome, than the possibility of unhealthy use or what used to get called addiction, although we're moving away from that language. So I think that really it's still the most dangerous thing is getting caught. And so we still really need to focus on ending the drug war. Part of the issue is that I think fundraising around that issue, right? It's going to take money. It's going to take, organizational capacity to end the drug war. And fundraising in the age of COVID, I think, is going to be very interesting and very different than it was pre-COVID. Money is going towards different priorities right now. And so I think that's going to be one of the big challenges, is figuring out how we sort of leverage people with resources into this fight, how we make them understand the connections between COVID and Black Lives Matter and structural racism and the drug war, which are all very interlinked sort of phenomena. And so figuring out how to message that to the people who have not just money, but the other sorts of access that you need to end the drug war, right? The people who can make connections to politicians, the people who can, speak out on their Twitter accounts and broadcast a message. I mean, there's people out there who have, 3 or 4 orders of magnitude more social media reach than anyone I personally know involved in ending the drug war. And so, if we can get, the sort of big names in social media to start, putting this information out there about how dangerous the drug war is, how destructive the drug war is, hopefully we can start moving society in that direction where they recognize that this has to end.
So it sounds like the danger is still there. It's just as impactful, but the messaging is going to be more difficult.
Yeah, the messaging is going to be tricky, and it's going to have to be done in a really, really careful way. Because people don't intrinsically see the connection between ending the drug war and dealing with COVID. But there is direct connection, right? I mean, we are talking about, if you look at most city budgets, the vast majority, I saw a post recently that it was a sort of a joke, but it wasn't really a joke, is that from a budgetary perspective, cities are police departments with some tertiary services, right? The majority of their budget is law enforcement. And so if we can take those budgets and shrink those police budgets, particularly when more than 50% of arrests are because of drug use, right? So literally ending the drug war means 50% reduction in law enforcement needs, right off the top, right? That's just right off the bat, we can save half of that money, which means we have more resources for treating things like COVID, more resources for dealing with the coming wave of homelessness that's going to happen when, mortgages stop getting paid and when people haven't been paying rent, and, courts have been backlogged, but in Colorado anyway, as of Monday, they're now processing evictions again. So as of this past Monday, evictions are happening, and those clocks are ticking. And so, when you have millions of people who are facing homelessness, the homeless are overexposed to pandemics, these are directly linked phenomenon. We have to end the drug war in order to have the resources to deal with these things properly. That's not my primary personal motivation for ending the drug war. I'm a cognitive libertarian. I just firmly believe that human beings have the right to alter their consciousness any way they want. That's just sort of a core part of my personality, is I just believe that we have that right. That argument just doesn't play well with politicians, right? It's a great argument for people who like that argument. It doesn't play well with people who do not recognize this as a fundamental human right the way that I do.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I almost hate to voice this, but it sort of feels like there's been this kind of superseding of importance within, like, I don't know, I feel it a little bit in the psychedelic community and just in the movement as a whole. It sort of feels like, oh, there's a global pandemic going on, and
Yep.
it's I appreciate you making that link, like building that bridge between the two things.
Yeah. And, this is sort of the reality of issues like the drug war that operate sort of in the background for most people. Most people, particularly non-drug users, don't feel like, oh, the drug war doesn't impact me in any way, right? The drug war doesn't do anything to me. So where's my urgency for, even if I disagree with the drug war, right? Even if somebody disagrees with the drug war, why should I have this like emotional connection to ending the drug war? It's like, well, the drug war impacts you no matter what, right? Even if you don't do drugs, the odds of police raiding a wrong house, which is a thing that happens, like with enough frequency that you can't really document it because it happens so often, right? That's a risk that every American faces, is the police kicking down the wrong door, guns drawn. People have died that way. People who had no involvement in the drug trade whatsoever. The police have gotten the wrong address, kicked the door down, and killed people. uh, the erosion of your Fourth Amendment rights, the fact that, drug dogs are wrong more than 50% of the time. Like, it would be less of a civil rights violation if you just flipped a quarter to let police search your car or not. Uh, that impacts you whether you're a drug user or not. Getting pulled over and having your car searched. And, I've seen door panels popped off. I've seen seats taken out of cars where they found no drugs at all. That impacts you no matter what. And the fact that, when it comes to like your local tax budget, if 50% of your city's budget is law enforcement and 50% of the arrests are the drug war, that means 25% of your city budget, 25% of the tax money that you're paying is going to enforcing the drug war. And that's money that's real money, right? That's real dollars. That's money that's not going to other things. That's money that's not going to dealing with homelessness, with COVID, with, a million other issues that we could be addressing as a society if we just didn't focus so much on this, this sort of non-crime of people altering their consciousness.
Yeah, it's really wild. It almost reminds me of like a disease that you can't quite see immediately, like Lyme's disease or something of the nervous system.
Yeah.
Systemic, endemic, it's everywhere, but you don't always see it. Um,
Yeah.
so the next question kind of ties into that. If lack of access to psychedelics is merely a symptom of a larger disease, that is prohibition, is the entire psychedelic renaissance just sort of a palliative treatment addressing the pain without getting at the root cause?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we should probably think about this not just in terms of psychedelics, but in terms of all substances, right? I think that's sort of an important qualifier to that, because psychedelics really are the sort of most democratized of all drugs. It's in terms of like technical feasibility and, chance of being caught. I think certainly growing mushrooms is lower risk than growing pot, right? I think it's easier to grow mushrooms without getting caught than it is to grow pot without getting caught. Particularly in the thankfully now long gone days of, flyovers with thermal cameras where they were looking for grow operations, which was a thing, in every state in this country. Just 10 years ago, they'd fly over and look for grows. Now in states that have, legality or, even medical legality, that's become less of a priority. For people who live in states where it's not, I'm sure that's still a thing. So psychedelics are a really sort of democratized drug. Anyone who wants to take the time to sit down and learn how to grow mushrooms. Spore prints are illegal in a handful of states, but realistically, if you start reading about how to grow mushrooms, it's not that hard to gather wild spore prints, right? People go on vacation to Florida. It's not that hard to find a cow field. It's not that hard to find a spore print. So really the thing that stops people from having access to psychedelics is either an unwillingness to break the law or an unwillingness to do that. The drug war, to me, is not just about allowing people to have access to drugs, right? It's about fixing the reason for the drug war. And Michelle Alexander laid out the evidence really, really, really clearly in her book that, when slavery ended, a system was created to allow that further racialized control of society. It was created as Jim Crow. Jim Crow existed for a long time. And then when Jim Crow fell apart, the drug war was explicitly created to allow for that type of racial control over society. The drug war was never really about the drugs. It was always about who is doing those drugs. right? If you look at the old newsprint stories from the 1920s and 1930s, the focus was always on the dangers of minorities doing these drugs. And you see the same sort of tropes repeated over and over again, including about, things from marijuana all the way to crack in the 1970s. You'll have newspaper stories that you could literally just like copy paste the word marijuana in, right? Or crack cocaine in. And it was all about like, oh, white women do this drug and they want to sleep with, sleep with African-American men, although believe me, that's not the word they were using. And so you see these sort of tropes, Hispanics do it and they go on these murderous rampages. They would say this about marijuana. They smoke a marijuana cigarette and they go on these murderous rampages. But the focus was always on the person who was doing those drugs. And I think it's really important for people to recognize that slavery is legal in the United States for people who've been convicted of crimes, right? It's literally an exemption in the 13th Amendment. It says, slavery shall be prohibited except upon conviction of a crime. And so by creating the drug war and then having unequal enforcement within the drug war, right? You don't see the police in New York doing stop and frisk searches at Ivy League schools in New York. But believe me, if they did, a lot of those students would be going to jail, right? So it's not about it's not about, the drugs, it's about who's doing it. And they focus their enforcement on certain communities. And then those communities are brought into the system where slavery is legal. And we have a massive prison labor force in this country, which again, a lot of people say, oh, like, why do I care about prison labor? I don't do drugs. I'm never going to end up in that situation. But having hundreds of thousands of people who are legally required to work for $1 an hour depresses wages for people outside of prison too, right? That directly impacts the wages of the people in your community, that there's this massive prison labor force created by the war on drugs that has to work for $1 an hour or less. And that is really the purpose of the war on drugs. That was what the war on drugs was about, was creating that private prison labor, or not private prison, but prison labor. Private prisons are a sort of new phenomenon within this, overarching shit show. It's the prisons, or prison labor specifically, is what the issue is. And so, yeah, even if you've never done drugs, your wages are directly reduced. They're directly impacted by the war on drugs, creating this prison labor force that is sort of mandated to work as legal slavery.
It's a horrific situation. It almost feels like there's this disparate island that is the psychedelic renaissance and psychedelic interest that in the minds of some people almost exists separate. It exists as a business opportunity or as a therapeutic opportunity, separate from the war on drugs or certainly systemic racism.
Sure. And the medical folks in particular, I think, are really sort of guilty of this otherization of all the other drugs, right? The psychedelic exceptionalism, however you want to phrase that. And I think that, an important part of that is that the medicalization of drugs actually in some ways depends on prohibition, right? If people can access all of these drugs outside of a medical context, that doesn't mean that there would be no medical potential, right? MDMA in particular, MDMA on its own doesn't really help PTSD. It is the MDMA psychotherapy. The psychotherapy is the sort of really important part of that component. And so even if MDMA was legal tomorrow, even if you could swing by 7-Eleven and pick it up, MDMA psychotherapy would still be a thing because it really is the therapy that helps. Psilocybin for cluster headaches as a sort of example, creating an effective medical model for that depends on psilocybin not being legal outside of that context, right? If anybody can grow mushrooms at home legally, then everyone who has cluster headaches is going to, get some rice and vermiculite and start growing mushrooms. And that's the sort of end of your medical model. And yeah, I think that way of understanding drugs, of thinking of, psychedelics are this one thing and all these other drugs are this other thing, is really, really dangerous. I think it's really dangerous for psychedelic users, for non-psychedelic users, for the policy movement as a whole. Psychedelics can be really, really amazing transformative tools of change. But all the time when you bring up psychedelic medicines, there's always the one person, generally not a psychedelic user, it's generally people who are just sort of opposed to drugs in general, who says, what's next, medical meth? And it's like, no, medical meth is already legal in this country. Its brand name is Desoxin. It's manufactured, like, it's medical meth is already a thing. It has been for 50 years. Like 50 years, medical meth has been a thing. And like, that's Desoxin. That's literally the brand name of methamphetamine in the United States for medical use. If you look up you can look up like any medication online. If you look up Desoxin, methamphetamine hydrochloride, that is the only active ingredient. It is medical meth. And so, yeah, to me, that argument is always so funny. Like, oh, like what's next? Medical cocaine? It's like, nope, that brand name is Gipralto.
Already
Like,
got
that
it.
is also a medicine in this country. Like, medical cocaine is already legal. And so, yeah, this idea that like, oh, we need to medicalize psychedelics, but these other drugs don't have any merit to them, is just demonstrably false. I mean, medical methamphetamine is a tremendously useful substance for a lot of people. Medical cocaine is a tremendously useful substance for a lot of people. It's a really good topical anesthetic. Medical ketamine for particularly for children who need surgery is an absolute wonder drug. I mean, it's a really great anesthetic for people who need it as an anesthetic. Aside from its therapeutic potential, which is sort of the newer use, its traditional use is just as a human anesthetic. But yeah, I think that we really need to be thinking about the drug war as a system of control, the drug war as a tool of white supremacy, and how we can dismantle that system and not get caught up on, oh, let's legalize this drug over here, but not this one over here. And, you hear people all the time say, oh, like, let's legalize these natural drugs, but not synthetic drugs. And it's like, well, cocaine is a naturally occurring alkaloid of the coca plant, but the decriminalized nature people don't ever want to talk about that, right? Like, they don't want to talk about the fact that cocaine is a naturally occurring alkaloid, and that LSD is semi-synthetic, right? They don't. That's not a conversation they want to have. So,
Yeah, they kind of treat the other drugs like, I don't know, the ugly cousin in the same family. It's just rejected and put in the house. Do you think the medicalization effort will get in the way of the cognitive liberty effort? Do you think it'll take an active stance against it?
potentially, I think that's a risk. It depends on who you talk to. Some people within the medical community are really hyper aware of the sort of larger systemic issues and the bigger fight. I mean, Rick Doblin in particular is like probably one of the most influential people in my life outside of my family. I've known Rick since I was in my early 20s. And he's just been like a hugely influential person in my life. And a lot of what I think about the drug war is directly influenced by him, right? I mean, and he's clearly on the medical side. He's a bit of an outlier in that he is also a person who has used drugs and talks about that openly. A lot of the medical people don't want to talk, they don't want to talk about their own MDMA use. They don't want to talk about recreational stuff. They just want to talk about the medical model. And Rick is very open about his own sort of reasons for supporting all of this stuff. I think it's important that we as a community are careful about who we support in their efforts to develop these things, who we support with our money, who we support with, our sort of social media voice. And I think that we really should be asking the people who are trying to develop these things as medicines, what are your thoughts on prohibition? What are your thoughts on the drug war? What are your thoughts on structural racism? They need to be open about that. And if they're not willing to be open about that, if they're not willing to answer those questions, that tells you something about those people and about how they view, the drug policy movement, how they view drug users.
So this could be kind of like a sorting question. The way that somebody responds to this could, in a big way, identify where their allegiance lies, and if they're Jedi or Sith. To put
right.
All right, so let's move on to the next question here. You've kind of touched on it a little bit already, but it's how can the psychedelic community do more for communities of color?
Yeah, I think that's a super important question, and also really revealing in the phrasing that we think of those as two separate communities. Right, the Mazatec shamans in Mexico have been using mushrooms as part of their ceremonial context for at least 4,000 or 5,000 years. I mean, we have archaeological evidence dating back at least 3,000, and clearly by that time it was like an established part of their culture. This is a living tradition. There are Mazatec shamans working in the highlands right now who are part of a living tradition of mushroom use that dates back probably, 3 times as old as that, right? We can prove it 3,000 years ago. This is probably a 10,000-year-old living tradition. And so the fact that we think of psychedelic communities and communities of color, the Bwiti in Africa using ibogaine, like, they are in Africa. They are clearly communities of color. This is a part of their tradition. And the fact that Western medicine wants to take this healing psychedelic root that is part of that culture, and somehow remove it from that cultural context and then bring it to European communities, not by design, but by outcome, right? These are the people who have access to these very expensive medicines. There are statistical realities about what sort of their ethnic makeup is likely to be. I find that really horrifying. I find it really horrifying that the Bwiti are left out of these conversations about what is ibogaine, what should it be. The attempt to create ibogaine analogs, which are non-psychedelic but still have healing potential for opioid addiction. I would very much like to hear Bwiti voices involved in this conversation about, should we be doing this? Should we be taking this traditional medicine and chemically altering it for a sort of Western, allotropic medical context? I find that really, really problematic that those voices are not centered in the conversation. I find it really problematic that, the legalized psychedelics, legalized mushroom campaigns are not centering the sort of historical importance of the Mazatec in this conversation. I showed you this, but I'll grab him really quickly. So this is a Western shaft tomb mushroom figurine. You can see he's holding his mushroom there and shoving another mushroom in his mouth. And this thing predates Christianity. This is thousands of years old. These are real traditions. These are real things that have been going on for thousands of years. Now, that being said, ignore, because that doesn't really answer your question. I think the way we can, and the other community I wanted to mention is the Native Americans using peyote, right? Those voices are out there. Iron Rope is involved in the Native American church. He's not that hard to find. The dude has a social media presence. If you want to talk to a Native American who specializes in peyote conservation and peyote use among indigenous American communities, those people exist. They're out there. They're happy to speak on panels in a large way. I can't speak for any of them, but they have spoken on panels, so clearly they're willing to do that. And I think the importance of centering those voices is one of the ways that we can do that. I think turning our psychedelic activism into anti-drug war activism is absolutely the best thing we can do. My ancestry has a lot of Hispanic and a lot of Native American in it on my father's side. My mother's family is European wholly, but my father's side is Hispanic and Native American. But I'm very white presenting, right? I look white at first glance. My last name is Gomez, so on social media, it's immediately given away, right? It's like everyone immediately knows. But even then, it's like I don't have this lived experience that most people of color have in the United States, because I was raised in a relatively, well-off upper middle class home. I'm very sort of white looking in general. People often have a sort of hard time placing me. Mediterranean is often the guess, right? That I must like, oh, maybe Italian, and then they see Gomez and they're immediately like, oh, you're Hispanic. But no, I think centering voices of color and turning our psychedelic activism and anti-drug war activism, because I know for sure that if I was not as white presenting as I am, there are times in my life I almost certainly would have gone to jail, right? If I was I've been pulled over for broken taillights at times, particularly when I was like much, much younger, and often had weed with me in a state where it was not legal. Actually, at that time, it wasn't legal anywhere. So, early 2000s, like getting pulled over for a broken taillight, almost always had at least like a joint or two in my car or on my person. And that's the end of that story. Like, I never got searched. I never got pulled out of my car and had my car tossed. I never got caught. I never had any of those things happen to me, because I look white enough that those things don't happen to me. And then, I had in Florida in the early 2000s, I had a very good friend who was African American, not just African American. His father was actually from Africa. He was very, very dark skinned, owned a whole chain of gyms, was incredibly financially successful, and ended up selling his Porsche because he got sick of driving it because of how often he got searched. Because they would see this young African-American man driving a Porsche, and it was immediately like, there's no way you own this car. They'd pull him over. Oh, you do own it, but you must be a drug dealer, because like, how else could you own this? You know, he'd get pulled out of his car and put in handcuffs, and, you know, everything tossed out of his car, and he sold it. He sold the damn car because of how often he got searched. And so it's like, I just know that if I was a person of color, like, there are times in my life I almost certainly would have gone to jail because of the drug war. And that's really horrifying. I don't know if you've ever seen the hashtag criming while white, but it's just people talking about times they would have gone to jail if they weren't white. And it's like, yeah, like, that's real. Like, that's real. I got away with things because I'm white presenting that I would not have gotten away with. And so I want every white person watching this video who happens to use substances or ever has used substances to like think about times that things could have gone wrong, and think about how those times probably would have gone wrong if you were, you know, presented as a person of color. Because the drug war really is the primary tool used by law enforcement to harass minority communities. Like, that's just clear statistically. If you look at the statistics of arrests, convictions, I already mentioned it, but if you have not read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, I cannot recommend this book enough. It is an astonishingly well-researched and well-presented book that, in my opinion, really proves all of this stuff, that the drug war is a tool of white supremacy. And one of the things she talks about is, you know, there are more white drug users in this country than there are drug users who are people of color. But people of color are overrepresented in arrests for drug use. Once they've been arrested, they're more likely to be charged with a felony, even if you account for the amount of drugs and the sort of arrest. The only factor that explains these differences is race. They're more likely to be arrested for a felony. And then once they're charged with a felony, they're more likely to be convicted of a felony. Right? So even white drug users who get charged with felonies are more likely to be given plea deals that are non-felony plea deals. Once you're a convicted felon, you can be legally denied food stamps, housing, you can legally be denied jobs, you can legally be all these things, right? You now have this sort of legally enshrined pariah status that really incentivizes you to become further involved in the drug trade, right? If you can't get a good job because you're a drug felon, and you need to make money, there's a sort of built-in motivation there. Like, well, I'm already a felon, right? I've already been convicted of these things. I have no way of getting a good job. You can't get licensed as a real estate agent. You can't get, you know, all these things. You can't get licensed as a barber in some states if you've been convicted of a drug felony. You can't be a barber, which sets up a cycle of being rearrested, reconvicted, like the whole thing, right? It sets up this system. And so if we take away the drug war, if we take away that tool of the police to harass minority communities, that would be the single greatest gift that we could provide. And so I think that's really what we need to do, is focus a little bit less on psychedelic activism and a little bit more on true anti-drug war activism, on attacking the drug war as a system, on recognizing its roots and its roles within maintaining white supremacy, and really messaging that as much as we can, particularly to our parents' and grandparents' generation. You know, really explaining to our parents and to our grandparents how the drug war operates, giving them the information they need to understand what it does within our society. You know, that Michael Foucault quote, you know, people often know what they do, people often know why they do what they do, but they often don't know what they do does. And so what doing the drug war does is maintain white supremacy. What the drug war does is arrest drug users. What doing the drug war does is creates these systems of control that we need to dismantle. Yeah. I've never gotten to quote Michael Foucault on a webcast. That's amazing.
Nailed it. Nice. Yeah, that's a really good one. So identifying, like, letting people know what they do, and maybe tying the drug war into racism just very clearly, and being like, if you support this, you support white supremacy. That,
like, period. I mean, that's just like really, 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 like, read her book. There's a few others I can recommend at the end of the podcast, but like when someone says what's one book I need to read on the drug war, that's the one I always recommend.
The New Jim Crow. Yeah, it's really good. She makes an argument in that book that it's like a freed slave had more rights than a drug felon today.
Correct. I mean, that's literally true. A freed slave was more free than a drug felon.
It's so weird, man. I was listening to that audiobook while I was driving across the country. It made me so paranoid that I pulled over and was just like, okay, wait a minute. Like, okay, I need to just like make sure there's nothing illegal in this car.
No accidental manifestation.
Right. I was in Utah. I'm like, I just came from Colorado. I need to pull over. This is freaking me out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I met her at one of the DPA conferences, and she's really like, really an astonishing woman. I mean, she really understands. It's easy to read her book, recognize the truth, and then amplify that message. But to like see the truth that she saw sort of through the fog of drug war propaganda is like astonishing. I mean, she's really something.
It's cool. Yeah, it's amazing when somebody backs up their work like that. And I've never seen such like an incredible compendium of facts.
It's a heavily cited book. I mean, heavily citationed book. Like my reading list that grew out of that book was like 30 or 40 books long.
Right.
Like,
every 5 minutes is just blowing your mind. It's just like, really? This is the world that we live in?
Yeah.
A phone call. So the next two questions are kind of similar. You've touched on them a little bit. I mean, I hate to. It's almost like it's not beating a dead horse because this thing is like.
No, it's okay. Let's just go through them.
This thing is like alive and bucking still, very much.
Yeah.
It's like, God, I wish it was a dead horse.
Yeah. Longing for the days of it being a dead horse. Yeah.
Right? Make glue out of this fucking thing. Okay, so what are the most important reforms or new policies that need to be implemented in order to end the war on drugs? Also, do you think there are any changes that could be made at a government level? And this is maybe the more slightly different question. Any changes that could be made on the government level that would get to the root of many social rights movements, class, race, LGBTQ, the drug war at the same time? So if psychedelic prohibition is one layer within the tree of the drug war, is there a bigger layer? Is there some like master issue?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a lot. A sort of legislative kill shot to the drug war, right? I am fundamentally a revolutionary. I'm really sort of uncomfortable with incremental change. The incrementalists definitely get more done. I'm not knocking that part of it. Like the fact that Kevin was able to, Kevin and his team were able to like functionally decriminalize psilocybin in Denver is amazing. I'm not knocking incrementalism for their results. I'm knocking incrementalism for other reasons. For their results, the results speak for themselves and they're very successful. I think that the solution is a constitutional amendment defining bodily autonomy. We own our bodies, we own our minds, and the government cannot legitimately infringe upon that right. Right. So the important thing to recognize about the Constitution is that it was written not as an exhaustive list of our rights. It was actually written as a list of things that they recognized at the time as inherent rights. These are inalienable rights, right? These are rights that exist and we recognize them, but we also recognize that we might not think of other rights that need to be codified this way. So they intentionally created a mechanism for expanding upon those recognized rights. I already recognize a right towards bodily autonomy, right? And most people do if you message it to them correctly, right? Should the government be able to tell you what foods you can or can't eat? Is a question that most people sort of immediately recognize as like, no, that would be absurd, right? That would be absurd. And I think doing it as a constitutional amendment towards bodily autonomy does a couple things. But one of the things it does is it lets us build a broader coalition, including people who maybe don't care about ending the drug war. Right. So it brings in the reproductive rights people. It brings in Planned Parenthood and all of that big money reproductive rights people. It also brings in all of the tech transhumanist folks, right? All of these tech guys, the tech bros, for lack of a better term, all of the tech guys, they all want to upgrade their brains. They all want to become transhumanist cyborgs. It's like, you really think the government is going to let you upgrade your prefrontal cortex? They literally don't even let you smoke weed. Like, if you literally can't even smoke weed on a federal level, right? The federal drug laws are so absurd, right? The fact that we class marijuana as a Schedule I drug is just like the most sort of patently on its face absurd thing in federal law. You think they're going to let you inject nanites that are going to like create new neural structures? Like, you are out of your mind. That is going to be military tech reserved for the military. There's no way they're going to let you do this. And so we have to establish bodily autonomy, cognitive liberty, however you want to, write. I'm not the lawyer who will write the amendment. But I really do think that should be our goal as a movement, is a constitutional amendment that recognizes bodily autonomy. It puts to bed forever the abortion debate. It ends the drug war. It makes sure that we'll have access to transhumanist technology when it comes online, which I'm really excited about. And so I think that's the solution. There was a two-part question to that, though. You said legislatively, what are the sort of policy changes that we can implement? Short of a constitutional amendment, which is a big ask, right? I mean, that's a big thing. I think in the immediate terms, decriminalizing or at the bare minimum defelonizing personal possession of all drugs should be a top priority for every activist in the country. Colorado has now done this. We have defelonized possession of almost all drugs. There was a tiny handful of drugs that law enforcement was sort of pushing back on, including ketamine, weirdly enough. So we are now at the point in Colorado where there are legal ketamine-assisted psychotherapy clinics that are putting up billboards, right? I mean, these are not subtle. These are billboards. But possession of any ketamine is a felony, and possession of heroin and fentanyl is a misdemeanor. So that's where we're at in Colorado, because they were fighting us on ketamine. And so that's it. But most drugs now in Colorado are defelonized. It's a misdemeanor possession charge. That's a bare minimum. Simple possession of illicit drugs is not a crime that rises to the level of seriousness that felonies are supposed to embody, right? Felony is supposed to be a really serious drug, or really serious crime, right? Felonies are supposed to be serious crimes, and simply having drugs on you for you to use does not rise to the level of seriousness that a felony is supposed to be. And so that's a bare minimum bottom line standard for all 50 states that we should hit, is removing possession from the felony category. Outright decriminalization is better. Still not enough, though, because adulteration within the black market is intrinsic to the black market. It's always going to happen in black markets. And so as long as you have black market distribution of the drugs, decriminalization does not fix things like fentanyl showing up in cocaine, or NFL being sold as MDMA, or the N-bomb family being sold as LSD. Those problems don't go away with decriminalization. So legalization is better than decriminalization. I think that we should be working towards legal, regulated marketplaces. I really want LSD being sold with QR codes on it that you can scan, and it tells you the date of manufacturing, how many micrograms. Like, I want that level of quality control within drug markets. But other small steps we could take, things like ending cash bail. If you look at most counties, the county jails, the majority of people in most of those county lockups have not been convicted of any crime. They are simply there because they're too poor to pay for their bail. We should not be incarcerating people for poverty. We should not be incarcerating people simply because they don't have the money to get out before their trial. Either a person can be trusted or they can't. If a person can't be trusted, it shouldn't matter how much money they have to be cut free. And if they can be trusted, we should let them go and they can come back for their trial. Most small-scale drug offenders are not going to uproot their lives and skip town to avoid a misdemeanor drug charge. It's absurd that you could be locked up for 6 months or a year for a crime that the maximum punishment is 3 months in jail. That's just absolutely absurd. It should never happen. So we should end cash bail, full stop. Either we can trust these people to be let out, or we can't. End of it. I also think that outlawing drug dogs are wrong more than 50% of the time. That is not good enough for violating your Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. Drug dogs should be illegal. They are simply not accurate enough to be allowed to do this. And the other thing is not allowing police to arrest and charge people before they perform laboratory analysis on the drugs. Reagent test kits are actually relatively accurate if you use enough different panels, enough different reagents, and you follow the instructions and you know what you're doing. The single-use drug identification kits that are sold by some companies to law enforcement are frankly trash. Some of them react on anything. There's one, in fact, called the modified cobalt reagent that is often sold as a cocaine test kit for law enforcement. I was really excited about it because cocaine is actually kind of hard to reagent test, so I manufactured some. DanceSafe manufactured some to test this reagent, and it turned the same color for cocaine as it turned that with almost everything we tested it on. Dirt, tree leaves, I mean, literally anything you put in there turned the color that it's supposed to turn for cocaine. It is just a tool for manufacturing probable cause to search a car. That's all it is. I would testify to that under oath. It is a tool for saying, this is cocaine, now we can search you. So outlawing those single-use reagent kits, or at least outlawing incarcerating someone, right? Maybe you can detain them for a day while the sample goes to a lab. But like GCMS labs don't take that long to run samples. You should not be able to hold somebody for 3 months. Like there's a story out of Florida. There was a person who was held in jail for 3 months before the sample was tested. The sample was supposed to be cocaine. I would guess it was the modified cobalt reagent. And it ended up being kitty litter. Like it was kitty litter. And the guy spent 90 days sitting in prison because they used this single-use test that turns blue on everything. Like that needs to change too. And those are all easy changes. Those are all easy, incremental, modified changes. The other two big ones that I would push for is people should be pushing for legalized safe consumption facilities. These are run all over Canada, all over Europe. It's a place where a person who is using opiates, or any drug really, but it's primarily opiate users that use them, can go use their drugs. There's medical staff on hand. They've been running for decades in Europe and Canada. There has never been a single fatal overdose at a safe use or safe consumption facility anywhere in the world. Nobody has ever died from an overdose. People sometimes take too much and overdose, or they get fentanyl and they don't know it's in there and they overdose. But opioid overdoses, if there's medical staff on hand, is virtually never fatal. It's really, really easy to deal with. You Narcan somebody, you provide support breathing. It's really, really trivial to deal with. So we already have the tool to end overdoses in this country. Overdoses is the leading cause of death among people under the age of 40 in all 50 states. It's more people are dying from opiate overdoses in this country, or opioid misrepresentation in the case of fentanyl being in heroin, than died from AIDS at the worst year of the HIV crisis. More people die from this than car accidents, than gun deaths. It is a massive public health problem. We know how to end it tonight. We can end it tonight if we legalize safe consumption facilities. So that would be a big one. And the other one is legalizing testing, on-site testing. We send our test kits to all 50 states. There's a lot of states where it's a little bit gray. But I'm not talking about test kits. I'm talking about drop-in facilities run out of community health clinics where people can bring their drugs. They are run through analytical, equipment, not reagent testing, either FTIR or GCMS. And you can find out what it is you're taking, and that immediately ends fentanyl misrepresentation. It ends all the misrepresentation. Realistically, most of what DanceSafe does should be paid for by the government, should be done by the government, and this is one of those things. You should be able to go to any community health clinic, and just like you can pick up condoms, you should be able to pick up fentanyl test strips or take your drugs to be tested for fentanyl.
Yeah, it seems so straightforward and logical. It makes a lot of sense. I'm so glad that you have answers, that you have like specific things that like, this is what we can do and this is what we can do. Because it's easy to just sort of
so weirdly, this is actually why I like anti-drug war activism. It's very rare in our society to have big problems that have easy answers. And drug deaths is actually a big problem, but it does have easy answers. We actually have all the pieces. We have all the things we need to fix this. It's just a matter of political will. And that's really rare, right? You ask me how to end obesity in the United States, right? Like another big public health problem. And I have no good answers for it, right? How do we deal with a pandemic like COVID spreading? Like, I do not have any good answers for this. Like, there are no good answers. The drug war is actually relatively simple. And I like it. It's like, all right, just like legalize all the drugs and almost all the deaths end, right? So
yeah, super easy. So you think maybe we could use bodily autonomy as like a sail to catch more attention and move the.
Yeah, it's I think that bodily autonomy is the the big answer, right? That's the sort of ultimate answer. And again, I don't say adding it as a right? We don't add rights, we recognize rights. This is a right. This is either you own your body and your mind, or the government owns you. Those are the only two options here, right? Those are the only two ways to think about drug use in my mind. Either I am the sole sovereign of my body, or I am owned by the government. And I simply refuse to accept that the government owns my mind. Like I flat out refuse to accept that.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to accept. I think there's a lot of value in a message like that. People who don't care anything about psychedelics, 3%ers, and I can think of some.
Look, this is a bipartisan. We can get people from. Actually, the further right you go, the more appealing that argument is, right? So we can get people from the far right, the far left, the middle. This is a broad spectrum. People hear that and it like resonates with them, right? The government should not own your brain. Like that's a really clear message that resonates with a lot of people. But amending the Constitution is intentionally difficult. It's intentionally a big project. On a day-to-day level, honestly, I think ending cash bail would be one of the biggest things, and ending drug dogs would be another massive thing. And both of those are easy. Ending drug dogs should be the easiest thing in the world. Anything that is less accurate than a coin flip should not be used to search you. Right? Like, if the fact that it would be less of a constitutional violation to let the cops flip a quarter on the side of the road.
It's really nuts. It's really crazy. It's dystopian. It feels dystopian. It's like,
yeah,
man. Okay, so let's see. The next two questions are kind of related. And you kind of already touched on this, but I want to ask it just because somebody did write it here, and then maybe one or two more of these, and we can see about crowd questions.
Cool. Yeah. It's already 5:50. Wow, it's amazing.
I know. The time just flew by, so we're in already. How do you feel about psychedelic exceptionalism? People are praising mushrooms and cannabis. Now ketamine therapy is becoming mainstream, but meth, heroin, pharmaceuticals, and research chemicals are all looked down upon. Do you think this hurts the movement for full decrim or regulated markets?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely does. I think that's clear. I think it does hurt the movement. The drug war preceding banning one drug at a time. Oh, this big drug becomes a problem, so we'll ban it. That game is not a game we want to play in reverse, right? For a couple reasons. But the two big ones to me are that it's okay to recognize that different drugs in different contexts have different benefits and different risks. That's fine. There is no question that taking 30 doses of LSD is less likely to harm a person physiologically than taking 30 doses of almost any other drug. It's perfectly fine to admit that. I have no issue with that. And in that regards alone, the sort of effective dose to lethal dose curve, LSD is probably one of the physiologically safest drugs known to humanity. There is no known fatal dose. There's reports in the medical literature of people accidentally consuming thousands of doses and living. There's almost no medical drug that's prescribed or even over the counter that you could take 1,000 doses of and not die, right? 1,000 pills of Tylenol and you are done. Like done. It's fine to think of psychedelics as exceptional in that regard. That doesn't automatically mean that we should try to legalize them first, that they're better for people in the sort of, all caps better, BE. It doesn't necessarily mean that. And that's where I think people get tripped up, right? Like, of course, psychedelics are exceptional. Like, what other drug can fundamentally rearrange your ontological understanding of the universe? Like, of course that's exceptional. That doesn't mean that they should be treated differently in terms of whether or not people have a right to use them. Because you don't own other people's minds. They own their minds. And so it has to be up to individuals what drugs they want to use and how they want to use them. I was getting to the two reasons and I got off on a tangent. So the two big reasons is one, that psychedelics are so intrinsically physiologically safe, most of them, right? Things like, you can't fit a fatal dose of mushrooms in your stomach. Like your stomach can't expand to the point that you could eat a fatal dose of mushrooms. And so people are often like, oh, we should legalize that. And it's like, no. We actually need to legalize the more physiologically dangerous drugs first, right? Psychedelics, even in black markets, don't kill that many people because they're so physiologically safe. Heroin, where fentanyl gets cut into heroin because fentanyl is easier to smuggle, is killing 50, 60, 70,000 people a year. That we need to legalize first because that's where we're having the problem. So we need legalized, regulated supply in order to fix that problem. But the other reason that I think it's really important to not play that game in reverse is that there are obscure drugs that have been outlawed. We're never going to build a movement in this country around legalizing 2CB. Like, there's just not enough people who've ever used 2CB to like build a movement around legalizing it. 2CB is a substance that a lot of people find really amazing and really transformative and really a super, rewarding experience. And we shouldn't leave out those people just because they don't have enough of them to build a coalition around legalizing this, like, sort of obscure drug that was synthesized by some crazy white-haired dude in his cabin out in California, right? And so we don't want to leave people out in the cold just because they like a drug that happens to be, less popular. And then there's drugs that almost nobody gets really into, but still shouldn't be illegal, right? I've often joked that salvia is the drug so addictive, almost no one does it twice, right? Most people get one full salvia breakthrough and they're just like,
nope.
Never again, right?
Yeah.
And like salvia is another one of these drugs that has a, probably 5,000 or 6,000 year tradition of indigenous use. Almost no potential for physiological problems. Like, there is absolutely no sort of rational reason, even in a world where we all agree that some drugs should be illegal, there's still no reason for salvia to be illegal, right? And in a world where I think we can all agree that no drug should be illegal, certainly salvia shouldn't be illegal. But you're never going to build a coalition around it because of all the YouTube videos.
Right.
We've given them too much propaganda against salvia to use, because from the outside, watching a person undergoing a salvia experience as somebody who's never done a drug terrifies people. It is a terrifying thing to watch a person go through. 5-methoxy-DMT can be that way as well, right? Like 5-MeO-DMT, lots of people describe as the single most transformative experience of their life. From the outside, it looks like a nightmare. Like, it often looks really, 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 really horrifying. And so we're never going to build a movement around drugs like that we've given them all this propaganda. And so the movement has to be about the system. It has to be about ending the system of prohibition.
I see. So it can't be like a piecemeal sort of thing. We've got to.
It can't be a piecemeal. We're going to legalize MDMA, then we're going to. It's like, well, what about MDA? Like, there's people who prefer MDA. Like, we're going to leave them out. We can't do it backwards.
Yeah. That like discrepancy in availability and discrepancy of attention, that really creates some wild situations. I remember being a teenager and it being easier to get like methadone and MDPV than it was to get weed, because they were, before they were criminalized, they would just sell big red horse capsules of MDPV. And
at the gas stations.
Right at the gas station. Yeah. But if you wanted weed, you had to, it's like you had to, like the things that you had to do. It was nuts.
Look, I know people who absolutely love methadone. Like, I know people who like that's their drug, top of their list. Yeah. Like, why should those people be left out just because a lot of people don't like it, right? You get to make your decisions about what drugs you like, and I get to make my decisions about what drugs I like. That, like, there's like this one person I happen to know who really likes salvia. He gets to make that decision about what he likes. Most people try 5-MeO-DMT once or twice and they never touch it again because it's so sort of ego destabilizing that a lot of people can't really process the experience. And then I know people who did it every day for years and are better people for it. And so I think that we really need to be thinking big picture, like, what are we trying to do here? Because if you're just legalizing the drugs you like, that's not even really drug war activism. It's just sort of leveraging your privilege to make your life less annoying, right? Like, you just don't want to deal with the police. And so you're like legalizing the stuff you're into so you don't have to deal with the police. It's like, that's not really anti-drug war activism in the way that I think of it. It's just really kind of shitty.
Yeah, man, I really hope that calls some people out. I hope somebody somewhere feels attacked by that, because it's like, yes, that's the right. I appreciate that. Thank you for that holistic perspective. We need it. We need it really badly right now. Okay. NN or 5-MeO?
What do you mean? Like, my personal?
I don't know. That's just the question. NN or 5-MeO?
Oh, so for anyone who's not a chemistry nerd, they're asking if I prefer NN-DMT or 5-methoxy-DMT. NN-DMT is an undeniably beautiful show. I am not particularly artistic, particularly when it comes to like physically. Like I'm pretty good on computers at making stuff that I like what it looks like, but I can't draw a circle to save my life. I can't draw a straight line to save my life. The fact that I apparently have an alien Rembrandt in my brain that can create these like incredible fractal cityscapes that is stylistically consistent with the alien landscapes that other people see when they try NN-DMT is really astonishing. And that's the least interesting explanation, right? If NN-DMT doesn't actually take you into another universe, the fact that we all share a stylistically consistent Rembrandt in our brains that can be triggered by this drug is really amazing. I don't know what it means, but that's where we're at. 5-MeO-DMT is not a particularly visual experience. It's really pretty on the way in and on the way out. In the heart of the 5-MeO-DMT experience, there is no self or other. There's no you having the drug experience. And on NN-DMT, I'm always very aware that it's a drug experience. Like I always am very aware that like, this is a thing that happened because I smoked DMT, right? With 5-MeO, there's no you. There's no you having the thing. In fact, the realization that you are a separate being from the sort of pulsating fractal white ball of light that is the totality of the universe, and there's no past and present, the realization that that's not what's happening, that you're actually a person who, you know, smoked some toad venom, is probably the most earth-shattering realization I've ever had. Like when I realized I was a person who had taken a drug, I actually did 5-MeO-DMT in a sort of traditional context in a country where it was legal with a facilitator who's part of a community that has a traditional sort of understanding of the substance. And that realization that I was like sitting under a tree in Mexico and that I was not a fractal ball of energy that was the entire universe was as astonishing as if I woke up tomorrow and realized that like my entire existence as a human had been a dream and that I was actually an alien. Like it was that astonishing. It was like that much of an ontological shift. But I will say that 5-MeO-DMT resulted in months of disturbed sleep, of reactivations where I would have that feeling of like, oh, this is like definitely not real. This is like all a holographic projection and I'm like the program, like that was a lot to deal with as a person who has literally decades of psychedelic experience under my belt. Like I started using psychedelics when I was very young. I was still barely in high school the first time I did mushrooms, like decades of psychedelic experience. And 5-MeO-DMT kind of fucked me up for a while, like kind of a long while of learning how to process it. It's not really, I will never tell another person to take a substance or not take a substance. And I think you should think about any substance you're going to take really carefully and really do the homework and really prepare yourself as much as you can for that experience. 5-MeO-DMT is really on, like you should really think about it, really read a lot of trip reports. Whereas NN-DMT, like the fact that it's sold in vape pens at shows sometimes sort of says a lot about that drug, right? Like particularly at low doses, it's just like kind of a pretty and interesting experience that, you know, there's no physiological deaths ever from NN-DMT that we know of, particularly smoking it. I think there was one incident of a person who had IM'd it and vomited and asphyxiated. I have a sort of vague memory of reading about that. But in terms of smoking it, nobody's ever died. It's sort of visually really interesting. And so they're different drugs. The fact that the names are so similar is really problematic because people are like, oh, it's another type of DMT. And it's like, please do not think of 5-MeO-DMT as like another type of DMT. There are no types of drugs in the way that people mean it when they say that, right? Like molecules are molecules. Psilocybin is actually, if you look at the 5-MeO-DMT molecule, an NN-DMT molecule, and a psilocybin molecule, psilocybin and DMT are closer sort of structurally than 5-MeO-DMT is, right? So don't think of them as like a type of this other drug. That's not how drugs work. That's drugs are individual molecules with individual experiences, individual risks, individual potential benefits, and you just have to approach them as snowflakes because that's what they are.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's really
yeah. So I don't really have an answer for one or the other, but
I see. Yeah, I think yeah, just sort of curious about, you know.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's an interesting question for sure.
Yeah, your perspective on the two things. I think it's so easy to get them mixed up. I've been listening to a lot of like the Tea Fairy talk about it. I feel like she's one of the most engaging speakers on psychedelics in general.
Oh yeah, hands down.
She's incredible.
Yeah, some of my like absolute favorite. So my first Burning Man was 2008. I haven't gone every year since 2008, but I've gone quite a few times. had a lot of amazing experiences. And when I think back to Burning Man and I'm like, what are the moments that really stand out? A lot of them are like sitting next to a trailer in a camp chair talking to T Fairy. Like a lot of them, a lot of those moments are like moments of just getting to like engage with her, talking about psychedelics, particularly 5-MeO DMT, which is sort of the drug that she's like most she's written the most about it. She's really engaged with it. Anyone interested in that drug should really look up her poem, Mapping the Source. It's really worth reading, or there's some videos of her performing it online, or come to Burning Man, and she almost always performs it. She did it at Center Camp last year. She did a reading of Mapping the Source at Center Camp, which is amazing because often Center Camp is sort of a don't talk about drugs place. It's a lot of kids around, a lot of cops, so.
And she's just like, here's a poem about
smoking toad venom.
Yeah, that one I memorized like the last line of that one because it's just so useful. It's like, be careful, be prayerful, check setting and set, measure it out so you know what you get. Attention, intention, respect or regret. Yeah, I know that you know this, but please don't forget. I love that so much.
She's a really astonishing person. So, but actually, on the subject of 5-MeO DMT, the DanceSafe 5-MeO DMT card is printed as of today. I got the email today that it's printed, so we will be releasing that on the website soon. There's going to be a card and a poster because it has now gotten to that point. When Mike Tyson is talking about a drug on ESPN, DanceSafe has to have a card for it. And so Mike Tyson had a really transformative 5-MeO DMT experience, and he has been talking about it very publicly and very openly about how it changed his entire understanding of the world and who he is and his place within the world. It's rare that we have a figure of that world, the world of like literally of men beating the crap out of each other, who is like fundamentally transformed by psychedelics and willing to talk about it that publicly. And so we figured that we're probably gonna have a lot of people looking for information on this particular drug. And 5-MeO has actually resulted in a few deaths. They're rare, they're statistical outliers, but it is a drug that has killed people, which for psychedelics is sort of an outlier in terms of safety profile.
Like kill people toxicologically, not incidentally.
Correct. Yeah, toxicologically. Yeah, we think that it's mostly drug interaction. It seems to not play well with stimulants. If you have stimulants in your system, either cocaine, Adderall, methamphetamine, but even on its own, particularly not synthetic 5-MeO DMT, but actually the toad venom from the bufo toads. There are other chemicals within there that seem to have some cardiac issues, and so it's probably worth knowing that like these are real risks. And then there have also been deaths of people who, again, sort of either snorted it or injected it and were alone. And using any drug that literally removes you from consensus reality without a person there to like keep an eye on your body. People have died. Ketamine's another drug, right? Where like physiologically ketamine is very unlikely to kill you, but people using it alone have like fallen forward just onto like their own clothing, right? Like a t-shirt, and asphyxiated. They've died because they were alone and there was nobody there. You can just twist your neck in certain ways where your breathing is impacted. If you throw up and you're lying on your back and you're so far out of the world that you can't move, like throwing up can kill you if you're that intoxicated. And 5-MeO DMT is one of those drugs. You're not part of your body in that experience. You're not connected to this at all. And when you're so disconnected from your physical form, you have to have somebody there who knows what to do, who's keeping an eye on you, who knows that you're going to be in this other place. I had I don't want to get too into it, but like there's people that like were in my social circles. I wouldn't call them friends, but people in my scene who've died on nitrous oxide because they were using balloons or bags instead of balloons. Right. So with a balloon, if you're alone and you let go of the nitrous balloon, it sort of, right, it sort of floats off. If you're using a bag and you're on your back and you go out into nitrous land and that bag lands on your face, people have asphyxiated and died that way because of nitrous oxide. And so even a drug that's sort of I don't want to say as innocuous, but any drug that you can buy at a porn shop is clearly not that hard to get, right? Like it's not like a drug you need a connection to find. It's a credit card to buy. And so, any drug that's that easy to get that can kill you that way, again, just shows the disconnect between the legal reality and the risk perception, right? I mean, there's just this real disconnect in our society.
Huh. It's like if you're going to log into a different server, you want to keep your original server safe or something. Like,
right.
Like if you want to,
Yeah.
you want to like, okay. I didn't know that. I didn't know there was an LD. There's a reachable LD50 of 5-MeO-DMT.
So it doesn't seem to be about dose,
Huh.
right? It's
Oh,
not people taking a ton of it. You know, again, it's if you give me like 1% of the drug war budget, we could probably do the research to figure out why some people have died on this drug. But there was it's almost always people using toad, not using synthetic 5. It's people who are smoking toad venom. But there was a death in Spain. The person who was facilitating it was just arrested a couple weeks ago, where the person seems to have just had a heart attack and died. Like, it seems that's just what happened. Is the person smoked toad, they had a heart attack. Part of it might honestly just be stress response. Going from like, I mean, it's so fast. It's so fast that it's hard to even describe how fast it is. And part of the 5 experience is losing the idea of past, present, future. There is no sort of linear storyline of the experience. As soon as you're in the thing, the entire idea of past, present, future is like not a part of your whatever's happening. Like, it's not part of it. And so part of it might just be like your sort of lower reptilian brain just like freaking out at the fact that like past, present, future,
what have you done?
like that's a core part of like what we are, right? Like the fact that there's a thing that comes after this thing and before this thing is really central to our experience as a human, right? It's a thing that exists even in your dreams, right? Even in your dreams there's linear progression, and to have that like kicked out from under you, maybe just like people have a heart attack. It's just a heart attack. Like, it's literally just a heart attack.
It's the McKennian, like, literally dying from astonishment.
Literally dying from astonishment.
Literally dying, non-metaphorical, like, death by astonishment.
Yeah, and so that might be what's happening. Like, I don't know, because we haven't studied this. But that doesn't seem to happen with synthetic 5. Like I said, I'm not aware of any deaths from heart attacks from synthetic 5. So it's probably other chemicals that are present within the toad venom in different concentrations, right? This isn't a synthetic drug. It's people literally squeezing the paratotal glands of a toad onto glass, scraping it and drying it and smoking it. So there might be different concentrations of different chemicals from this little flake of toad venom to this little flake over here, right? There might be more bufatoxins here and more 5-MeO-DMT here. And it's a very sort of hit or miss substance. So yeah, I suspect it's bufatoxin cardiotoxicity, but that's a guess. I mean, I'm guessing. That is a guess. I do not have any way of proving that. But I will tell you one thing that happens is some people are so astonished by the experience that they don't record the experience in their like everyday memory. So people will smoke the drug, clearly have the thing happen. You can like, what, you know, they're on the floor. It's clearly happening. And they come out of it and then it's like, oh, it sucks. It didn't work, right? Like, it doesn't, like, they don't have any recorded memory of the experience. And that happens enough that like facilitators talk about it, about people doing it, coming out of it and just being like, oh, I guess this drug doesn't work on me. And it's like, it has been 23 minutes. Like, you know, like, so that happens where it's so different than this that this brain can't access the memory.
Wrong file format.
Wrong file format.
Yeah, it's like it's not staying there.
Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating, and it's so unfortunate that we can't study these things or that research is.
Yeah, so we're lucky because 5-MeO-DMT is legal in most of the world. It was not included in the original Controlled Substance Act, which the United States sort of exported. We made a list of illegal drugs and then we sort of exported it by economic threat, right? Well, like, we won't do business with you if you guys don't also ban all these drugs. So any drug on that original list is illegal almost everywhere, right? So things like NN-DMT was included on that original list. And so DMT is illegal almost everywhere in the world. 5-MeO-DMT was not on that original list. It was only outlawed in the United States, I believe, in 2010 or 2011. There was a group of people selling it at Bonnaroo one year, like with a tent, before it was illegal. Like, there was like a tent at Bonnaroo where you could like buy 5-MeO-DMT. I don't think it was like illegal. It wasn't like Bonnaroo hadn't given them permission to be there, but they like set up a pop-up.
We're definitely there, yeah.
They were there in a very visible way. You definitely used to be able to order it on the clear web with a credit card. It was legal. You just buy it. And so Canada, it's legal. Mexico, it's legal. So there's a lot of research going on with 5-MeO-DMT all over the world. We're just getting left behind in that research. I actually know a lot of US researchers who will like travel to other countries to do their 5-MeO-DMT research and then publish in the US. Like that's a dynamic as well. But it's unfortunate that we have to play these games. We were talking about activism earlier, but to me, one of the things that so many people don't realize is this idea of Schedule 1 and how hard it is to do legal research when a drug is Schedule 1. The fact that there's a government body which mandates and controls what drugs our scientific establishment can study is astonishing to me. It really blows my mind that the government tells scientists, this is okay to look at, this is not okay to look at. We should not have that at all within a clearly defined scientific context. How could anyone think it's okay for the government to mandate that certain drugs are just off limits to study? Is just so baffling. Like, of course we're going to get left behind. And 5-MeO-DMT is really starting to show some promise for people who are really, really physiologically dependent on stimulants. So like people who have really heavy methamphetamine users. We don't have any really effective treatments for stimulant dependency. So for like opioid dependency, methadone exists, right? Like we can give people opioids that they can take. Stimulants don't have anything like that. And people have been doing somatic psychotherapy with other drugs, particularly like 5-APB and other drugs that are like close to MDMA. So sort of like MDMA-ish psychotherapy, and then 5-MeO-DMT as like a hard psychological reset. Because when you come back, you really have this moment of like, okay, so this, I've thought for like a year now about how to phrase this, because anyone who's had a full 5-MeO-DMT experience, when I say this to them, they immediately understand what I'm saying. And people who haven't done the drug don't seem to understand what I'm saying. When I said earlier that you lose past, present, future, I think it's okay for people to conceptualize what it means to not experience linear time. But what people don't realize is that all of your memories, all of your life experiences, everything you've ever felt, everything you've ever thought collapses into the drug experience. And you have no way of differentiating past, present, future. You actually can't tell the difference between anything that's happened in the past and what's happening now. So when you come out of that experience, you have this moment of clarity about all of your life decisions in a way that you really didn't, like just before you inhaled this smoke, right? You really get a sense of like, oh, like this is now, like right now, and everything that's happened has already happened and I can't fix it. Whereas one moment before that, it was all the same thing. And so like, you didn't really have the sense of like, oh, I did A, so B happened, right? And I did B, so C happened. And when you're reestablishing that sort of causality in past, present, future, you really get to examine who you are as a person. Like you really get a unique opportunity in that moment to examine who you are as a person and how you got to where you are and how your life is. And it's proving really effective in some sort of underground treatment contexts for people who are really addicted to stimulants, to give them a psychotherapeutic context for understanding their life, and then a hard reset, right? What's the first thing you do when your computer's acting up?
Shut it off.
Like, you turn it off and turn it back on, right? First thing you do. And this is sort of the only drug I've ever experienced that felt like the neurological equivalent of that. It wasn't unconsciousness. It was off in a just totally different way. And so, yeah, I think pretty soon we're going to have methamphetamine treatment clinics that are offering this. I strongly suspect that, but not in the US, right? You're going to have to travel to Canada, which again, immediately excludes a lot of people. It excludes people who are too poor to access that therapy, too poor to buy plane tickets, haven't heard of this. And like, we just need to fix that. We need a holistic sort of reset of our drug policy. Because why should the only people who can get a medical treatment for stimulant use, why should that be excluding all of the people who are most likely to need it? Like that's absurd to exclude so many people. Like what percentage of Americans don't have a passport, right? Like just that, like excludes so many people. And it's really seeming to work. There was a presentation in Portugal that I attended on people who were doing this underground therapy work using 5-MeO-DMT. And the results they were having are amazing, amazing, amazing. And stimulant abuse is a huge problem in this country. It gets overshadowed by the opioid issue, but it's really a massive sort of problem all on its own.
Wow. Yeah. That painting that picture of what goes on in this country.
Yeah.
Kind of on that thread, what do we know about non-problematic substance use?
So I think one of the things that people don't realize is that even the DEA, if you look at the DEA's number of, I'll use heroin just because it has the sort of reputation as like the most addictive drug, right? You'll hear people all the time be like, oh, if you do heroin once, like you're addicted, right? You're never going to have you're just going to crave it forever. The DEA's estimate on people who use heroin who become physiologically dependent, who meet the DSM criteria for problematic substance use disorder, is somewhere around 25%. So 75% of even heroin users are what we would have to call recreational users. If you don't meet the DSM criteria for problematic use, by definition, you're a recreational user. It's not like there's a hard line, right? Where on this side of the line is recreational and on this side is addict in the old language. That's how people think of drug use, right? Either it's recreational or it's an addiction. That's not how drug use works. That's not how substance use sort of works within the human brain. There's a spectrum, and substance use is substance use. But it is clear that even for the drugs that have the reputation as being the most sort of problematic, the vast majority of users don't ever actually have any problems. The reason that we don't think of drugs that way is because of drug war stigma, right? So DanceSafe tests at lots of events, hundreds and hundreds of events. I've personally tested at hundreds of events. We virtually never have anyone come with opiates to ask us to test them. It almost never happens where people are like, oh, I have some heroin. I'd like to make sure it's heroin. But if you look at the distribution of, have you ever seen a drug amnesty bin at a festival, like before security, where you can drop your drugs off? So these exist at some festivals, and the guys who own that company test all those drugs for the festival promoters and law enforcement, right? So they actually have an FTIR, they run all the samples. And when they shared their data with me, I was astonished at how many opiates were in it. It was a lot of opiates. So even in our scene where drugs are really destigmatized, where people who would share a bump of ketamine with a complete stranger in the middle of a dance floor won't tell their best friend that they're using heroin to go to sleep at the end of the festival, right? Or that they're using it during the festival. And so the people that we see as, heroin users, I keep using this example, are the tiny percentage who their use has gotten to the point where it's apparent to people who don't know them, right? It's people who are so physiologically dependent or psychologically dependent that they're having these really sort of real life consequences. While the 76% or so who don't have those consequences don't tell anyone that they're using. And so we just have this skewed perception of drug use in this country because of who we see as drug users. The average heroin user, we never know they use heroin. They don't ever get arrested. They don't ever need medical care. They don't ever end up in a homeless shelter. They don't lose their job. They're just a heroin user. They're just somebody who uses heroin occasionally when they want to. And then when they don't want to use it, they don't use it. That's the statistical norm. Like, according to the DEA, that's not my numbers. That's the DEA's numbers. And I would imagine their numbers, if they skew in one direction or the other, skew heavily in a certain direction, right? If that data is not skewed to make heroin use look less dangerous. Right. I promise you that.
Not a chance, no.
And so, yeah, we have this sort of, but that's created by the drug war, right? That dynamic is created by prohibition. It's created by drug war stigma. It's created by the fear of arrest, by the fear of social abandonment. And so the way to fix the perception of drug use is to end the stigma, to end the drug prohibition, to end these systems that create so much fear. And while we end that, oh, did I lose you? Oh, spotlighted, I see.
Yep.
While we end that stigma, while we're doing that, we also reduce deaths, right? Most opioid deaths are preventable, but the reason they're not prevented is the drug war stigma, is the opioid stigma. The reason that people use alone is because they're afraid to tell even their best friend that they're using opiates. And so then if the bag ends up having fentanyl in it, or, you know, if the heroin is a little less cut than they're used to, there's nobody there to help them. And so they just sort of pass away from a completely preventable dynamic. And this happens with psychedelics too, right? People who were, you know, unknowingly sold 2,5-N-bomb and thought that it was LSD, they took the drug, and when they started having physical problems, I mean, 2,5-N-bomb is a drug that was physiologically killing people. It wasn't people, you know, behaving in ways that resulted in death. But those people were terrified to seek out medical care because they're on a psychedelic. They're in this world of like really heavy drug stigma. Oh, I'm not gonna call an ambulance. Like, I don't want to go to jail, right? And so we have all of these deaths that are so easy to prevent. I mean, it would be so easy to create safe containers for people to use psychedelics, right? Places where people could go, there'd be visually interesting things. We have a pretty good model for doing this, right? Like music festivals, you know, interactive art experiences like Meow Wolf. Like, we could build off of those models and create safe containers where any consenting adult who wanted to use psychedelics could come. The psychedelics would be exactly what they thought they were. The dose would be known. There would be people there who were trained in how to do psychedelic, you know, emergency support, you know, through Zendo training. We could create that container so easily where anyone who wanted to have these experiences could go and have them with virtually no physical risk of harm. Certainly far less risk than horseback riding or playing football or cheerleading or driving 100 miles, like way less risk than plenty of things that our society accepts, allows, encourages. We could create that space, we could create that place, we could create that world where anyone who wanted to use a drug could do so safely. And the thing that is stopping us is fear and stigma and racism. Like, that's literally what's stopping us from living in the world where anyone who wanted to try these things could, and almost nobody would ever die. You know, certainly less people than die from ziplining or, you know, paragliding. And so, yeah, I think that's the world we should be working towards, is a world where we recognize people's rights to engage with these substances, and we create the places and the sort of infrastructure that's needed for people to engage in these, just like they would any other pleasurable experience. You know, we allow pleasurable experience in this country all the time. And so just creating that world, I think, is a world worth building. And if we can, you know, leverage that into reducing structural racism in the prison population, that should be the ultimate goal. The creating the world where people can have the experiences is almost secondary in some ways, but they can be co-equal. Let's call them co-equal goals that we can be working towards.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful vision of the future. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, we're super close. I really believe it. When I was really young, I got to hear Alicia Appleman German speak. She was a Holocaust survivor. Not just survived in the sense of like lived in Europe at the time, like literally like on a train to a death camp and somebody kicked a board off and only the children could squeeze through the spot. I mean, she survived the Holocaust. And one of the things she said in her talk that has stuck with me all these years is that every major change in the world looks impossible the day before it happens and inevitable the day after. Right? So the idea that we would somehow end slavery in this country, the idea that the Holocaust and the Nazi regime would just end, you know, the idea that like women would have the vote, the idea that gay marriage would be legal, all of those things, the day before they happened, like, how could it ever happen? It's impossible. It's too hard. It's too big, right? It's too big of a thing to change. And then the day after, it's like, well, of course gay people should be able to get married. The day after it happens, it's inevitable that this would have happened. And I'm really hopeful that the drug war is one of those things, because it does look impossible from this side of the aperture. Like, it looks impossible that we would ever end this massive bureaucratic sort of behemoth that runs through our society. And so I'm hopeful that we're close to the day where we can all look back and say, like, of course anyone who wants to use these things should be allowed to use them. And of course the police shouldn't target minority communities for stop and frisk while they ignore the college campus that's 2 blocks over, where stop and frisk would statistically get them more arrests, right? And of course we should allow people to experience these things. You know, I don't agree with everything McKenna said, but that quote about, you know, going to the grave without having a psychedelic experience is like dying a virgin. I sort of agree with that. Like, it's a major part of who we are as a species. humans were carving mushrooms on cave walls thousands of years before we figured out how to write down a recipe. Like thousands of years before we figured out how to write a word, we were carving mushrooms on cave walls, right? Like it is such a central part of who we are as a species that I think that's actually really important to remember. Prohibition is the statistical or is the historical aberration, not the historical norm. And so ending prohibition is actually not a radical proposal. It's a return to what we've done for most of human history, where humans have been able to engage with these substances if they wanted to. And so what I want is a return to normalcy.
Yeah, man, that's a that's a perspective that's difficult to see sometimes. I really appreciate your vision and how well you can see it and how well you can articulate it, and taking the time to share it with us, man. It's really,
here's open.
yeah, taking the time, it really like makes me hopeful for the future. Like, okay, it doesn't always have to be like this. The way that things are right now is not how they.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the outlier. This is really, we're living in a period of anormalcy, and I think that we should all remember that this is not normal what we're doing. It's not normal to arrest people because they like a different plant than you.
Yeah, or our different skin color,
or a different substance, right? Or a different chemical. But yeah, it's just not normal. Like it's not what we've done for most of we're an old species, man. I mean, we've been kicking it around for 250,000 years. Prohibition started in the 60s. Like,
right. Yeah, 300,000 years
This
of
is a
Homo
tiny
sapiens.
little blip on the radar of our existence as a species on this planet. The norm is carving mushrooms in cave walls, right? This thing was so incredible. I'm going to carve it on this wall
Yeah.
so that my grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren will see it and remember, right? Like I want to pass this information down.
Yeah, you've got those mushroom statues literally behind you, and we're like, what was history like? What should we be doing? Where did we come from? It's like, oh,
right.
There's no need to ask. There's no need to ask.
There's no need to ask. They left us the records. They cared so much that they carved it in granite. So, right? like remember.
Yeah, man. Well, it is 6:30.
Well,
so I want to respect your time, man. Thank you so much for making the time today and sharing the vision of the world. I hope soon we can all get back to whatever the 2020 version of carving mushrooms in a cave.
Yeah.
We can.
Cool. Well, it was good talking to you.
Yeah. Likewise, brother. Do you have anything you want to add or share to the end here?
Just if you're it's obviously seen the music scene doesn't super exist right now. But if you're interested in volunteering with DanceSafe, our training's online. We have chapters all over the country, and as soon as events are happening, we'll be back out at them doing what we do. So if that's something that interests you, I highly recommend you get trained now. The training's online, so it's easy to do, and then you'll be sort of in our volunteer database.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody who showed up. Thank you, Mitchell, so much for taking the time and sharing your perspective, and we'll hope to see you guys sometime soon.
Yep. Have a good one.
Yep. Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.